All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this last session on effective teaching techniques. And in this last session, we are actually covering two topics, not necessarily fully connected, but two topics, and we'll spend half the session on each. One is assessment, and the other is student motivation. We'll spend about half an hour on each one of them. Okay, so I'll share my slide and then we'll get going. Okay, so this is what we are discussing: assessment and student motivation. Let's do a quick 1-minute recap. Again, we've already established that goal of teaching is to ensure learning. This is something I feel that we must keep emphasizing all the time to ourselves and to all our colleagues. The role of teacher is to ensure that student does things, because that's how students learn. Not by us doing a lot of things, but making sure that the students do things and they think. And so the goal for the instructor is really to, for an instructor, is that students achieve the learning outcomes that you've established for the course. For teaching a course, as we've said, what is a course? The course must have learning outcomes. You must establish them as to what is it that the student will learn as a result of this course. Okay. You should have then a good teaching plan for students to achieve the learning. And we should have then a suitable assessment to support learning. Right? These are the three elements of a course we've discussed, right? We have already discussed that establishing the learning outcomes, you can use Bloom's framework and its variants to establish the learning outcomes. We've also discussed that teaching plan that you have should include learning activities inside the lectures as well as outside the lectures, right? What you tell them to do outside of lectures. And during lectures, we've discussed that active learning exercises, maybe with peer learning as well, are the best ways to make lectures more of a learning experience than just giving lectures. Okay, so the only thing that is left of this framework that we've discussed is assessment, and that's what we are going to discuss today. So assessment has two main objectives in a course. First is to support students' learning, right? We've already established learning is the goal. So the assessment also supports students' learning. It helps students achieve the learning outcomes that you've established. But assessment is also needed to assess the students' achievement of learning outcomes. And assign a grade. And, hopefully, if everything is good, the grade indicates the level of learning the student has achieved. Both are related, actually, and you cannot really separate them that this is exclusively for learning and this is exclusively for assessment. Both are related. For example, assignments. Assignments are largely there to help in learning. So students can practice, they can try out things. But if you don't give any weight to the assignment in the final grade, then the students don't do it. So assignments also become part of the assessment of the student achievement. Exams, on the other hand, are on the other extreme. They're largely for grading, right? We know we give them exams to find out how much they have learned and give them a grade, but they also strengthen students' learning, because to prepare for the exam, the students will think and practice, and that's what helps them learn. So exams, which are largely for grading, also support learning. So assessment is an integral part of teaching. I know even I've said it, and many of my colleagues will say it, that, hey, look, I like teaching, but I don't like grading. But assessment is an integral part of teaching. Without good assessment, learning will simply not take place. So there are two types of assessments. These are just to explain things and understand. Terminology is only useful to that extent, but once you understand, you can get rid of the terminology. But formative assessments are low stakes assessment. They're largely to help students learn. So the learning first goal that we established, you have formative assessments for that. So then whatever information or data you're gathering from the class about students, it is to help the student learn. Okay. It should therefore have very little weight in the grades. Okay, that's why it's low stakes. Summative assessment, on the other hand, is a high stakes assessment. Its focus is on evaluating the student's learning, right? The second goal that we've set for assessment. So there you gather data to assess the student's learning level. And a balance between formative and summative is absolutely essential. Too much reliance on summative will provide a grade, but it has lesser value in learning. And that's one of the things we see in our country all the time. You have two major exams to give a grade and people get marks, and then we cry that students don't have learning. Because too much reliance on summative assessment, for example, just primarily a year-end or a semester-end assessment, okay, its only value is in assessment of the level of learning. It does not help in learning much at all. There is, by the way, another kind of assessment called diagnostic assessment, but we will just ignore it. It's to find the current skill level of a student. So formative to help students learn, summative to help assess how well have they learned. So formative assessments, let's spend a couple of minutes discussing each one of them. So the goal is to improve learning. So therefore, it may be done informally. So you may do it in the class, give a quiz, not worry too much about students discussing with each other. You can do it informally. You may actually encourage discussion even. But you must provide quick feedback so students can validate or correct her knowledge. So this is assessment to help the students learn. So when the student, suppose you do an assessment and student gives an answer and the answer is wrong, you must provide that feedback very quickly as to where it is that it is wrong, why is it wrong, and what may be the correct answer. So the student can correct her knowledge. So formative assessments must have quick feedback to students. Sometimes students have wrong understanding and they'll keep that going until it is corrected. It should be therefore ongoing, largely during the lecture. And you should be doing frequent lecture or tutorial or labs, what have you. And it should be fairly frequent because you want to keep assessing and keep, are they learning well? If not, you help them learn better, etc. So it is to improve learning and to get feedback as to how the learning is taking place. So you want to sort of do it frequently. You don't, so whatever small things you teach, they learn, you assess whether they've learned or not, and you keep moving forward. It's low stakes, that is the impact on final grade is low. The psychometric rigor. So this is the term they use for assessment, but you don't need very rigorous psychometric measures here, right? It's low stakes. It's more to help improve learning. So it could be less rigor. Frequent assessment with feedback is one of the most effective tools for learning. There's much research to support that. And these are all frequent assessment with feedback is essentially largely formative assessments. So the examples of formative assessments are observations. You just sort of give something and observe what students are doing, right? You give them something and walk around in the class and see how they're doing. Homework, you give them homework, see what they reply and see whether they got it right or not. Self-evaluations, you can give students self-evaluations on what do they think about some issue, how well they've understood or not. In-class quizzes, we've discussed that in active learning. Any Q&A session that you may have in the class, any discussion you may have in the class where students respond and your antenna is up and you're constantly assessing, have they understood? Are they with me? So those are all examples of formative assessments. Summative assessments, as we said, the goal is to evaluation of learning outcomes achievement by students. How well has a student achieved the learning outcome? So it's evaluation of the level of attainment of learning. So this is done formally, and it's often done cumulative after teaching. So you teach for a couple of weeks and you do a test. You teach for half a semester, you do a mid-semester exam. You teach for the whole semester, you do an end semester exam. So it's cumulative after you've covered many concepts, related concepts, and then you see how well the learning outcomes have been achieved by the student. It should also be consistent, of course, with what has been taught. It's high stakes because this is what largely a good portion of the grade that you will assign to students will depend on these summative assessments. And therefore, the psychometric rigor has to be high. Okay, so typically they use these three concepts for tests. It should be valid, it should be reliable, and it should be fair. We don't have to worry too much about it, but essentially valid is that the test should measure what it claims to measure. So in our case, we're saying it should measure the level of attainment of the learning outcomes in the course. So it should measure that. That's how it's valid. If you have some learning outcomes and your exams test for something else, then you've not really, your exams are not measuring the learning outcome. You're giving them marks and giving them a grade, but that does not mean that you have assessed the learning outcomes. Reliable is that consistency of scores, that a student with similar level of learning should get similar scores. And of course, if you do it multiple times, students with same learning will get same type of score. And fair is that freedom from any bias. It assesses what has been taught, etc. So fairness, we sort of understand that. So when you do summative assessment, and we all intuitively keep in mind that we only test for what we have taught, we want to test their understanding and how well have they done it, how well have they achieved the learning outcomes that we've established. And we generally, if you give proper questions, reliability sort of comes out. The learning value of summative assessment is not in the assessment itself as much. In formative assessment, the assessment itself gives learning value. There is an assessment, student applies himself, you give feedback, the student corrects his or her learning. Here, the learning value is more due to the thinking and practice the student does in preparation of the summative assessment. So it does have learning value, no doubt about it. Okay, what are the examples for summative assessment? Projects. Many of us use projects in our courses, and we give a fair amount of weight onto how well the project has been done. Portfolios of artwork, of writings, of various portfolios are used in many types of courses. Reports, a lot of courses would have students write reports, and reports can be summative assessment. And of course, examinations are favorite in the country, right? Those are also instruments for summative assessment. So this is just a table giving you some comparison, some side by side, what is formative and versus what is summative. We just discussed this. And what are the assessment instruments we have? We've already discussed in the examples we gave. But in-class quizzes, as in active learning, in-class discussions that you may have, assignments, presentations that you may have students do, projects that they may do, Viva Voce, any Viva you may do, term papers, reports, quizzes, tests, exams. You can think of various other ways to do. There's a range of assessment instruments we have at our disposal, and that many of us use. So designing the assessment instruments for our course. So the first goal is that together the assessment plan should support the learning goals, right? We've already established the learning outcomes, and whatever we do in assessment, it should support the learning outcome. So if there is an outcome called understand, that the student shall understand ABC, then we should have some assessment to check whether the student has understood or not, or how well has she understood. Similarly, if we have a goal that student can analyze something, then we should have some assessment to check the analysis capability. If we have a goal that at the end the student can code and test some programs, then we must have some assessments to check that they can code and test, and how well can they code and test. So first is that they they should support learning goals, because as we discussed earlier, if the students figure out that the assessments, particularly the summative assessments, those that are contributing to grade in a significant manner, are of a certain type, then their learning will align to that type and not to the learning goals. If you want learning outcomes for the students to achieve learning outcomes, you must assess them on learning outcomes. Okay, as I mentioned, frequent formative assessment with some summative ones is a sound way to design assessments. Frequent formative assessments and a few summative assessments. So lots of small in-class quizzes, in-class discussions, assignments, small problems, labs, all these are small, low risk, low weight assignment. Then perhaps one midterm, perhaps an exam. So those are high risk, high weight summative assessments. So let me summarize the assessment portion. Again, assessment is also it can get very technical. There is multiple books on assessment, as in every aspect of effective teaching, but we don't have to go too deep into it. As I told you in the start, my goal is to extract out a few very key concepts out of the literature and share them with you, which you can apply directly in your own teaching. And I think this, if you can just think of assessments the way we've discussed, that would just help improve your teaching directly. And then you can take it further by a further study. So assessments are integral part of teaching for learning. If you're teaching for students' learning, then assessments are an integral part. You cannot shy away from them. And assessments have two objectives: to support students' learning and to assess students' learning. Formative assessments focus on supporting students' learning, so they are low stakes, frequent, feedback, etc. Summative assessments focus on assessing students' achievement of learning outcomes. But they also help in learning because the students prepare and all that. A course should have a good mix of formative and summative assessment.